So I just want to say a warm welcome to you all on the first of our annual lectures. We want these to be part of what we do to really promote an awareness, thought and discussion on diversity. So we're hoping that's what we're going to do tonight. So I'm just going to welcome Michael, who was awarded an MBE in the Queen's 2020 Birthday Honours List for services to education and social entrepreneurship. Professor Lewis completed his education MBA at London South Bank University in 1997. So that's why he has an affinity with London South Bank. His career spans the fields of education, special educational needs, entrepreneurship and international education development. Most recently as Executive Chairman at the Riverston Group of Schools and Children's Centres operating in South East London, Macclesfield and Dubai. Now a visiting fellow of the Division of Education. In addition to his incredible support for this lecture, Michael has generously committed to support and fund an annual prize programme for LSBU students with an interest in education and neurodiversity. So for any LSBU students in the audience, and I can see a few, or for those thinking about studying here, the prize awards programmes will launch in September and more information will be on hand after this evening's very special event upstairs in the mezzanine. So please join us after the event because we will be able to have continued conversations there. So you can join us for a drink and continue the conversations. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Michael.
Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, can I echo Julie's warm welcome to you all, and thank you all for coming out tonight and joining with us at this inaugural lecture. I've been told there's a fairly strict timetable here, so like most academics, I would prefer not to have any notes and just talk, but we've only got a couple of hours to go, and Steve's got to do his lecture. So I'm going to stick to some notes, so excuse me if I read from some of them. Both my parents were teachers, and conversation around the breakfast and dinner table almost always revolved around education. It's therefore perhaps not too surprising that the language used to describe and comment on student learning and behaviour comprised a large part of my own lexicon, especially as I grew older and became a teacher myself. In my own 45 years of educational practice, I'm only too aware that children do not arrive with a manual. And for those with additional and or specific learning disabilities, including those who are differently abled, there are significant hurdles in identifying and finding the most appropriate help, as well as securing the necessary clinical, health, social care, education, and financial support families so desperately need. Yesterday, the local government association announced the number of children seeking SEND support had increased by nearly 25% in just the last year. That's an increase of over 170 new cases every day. I'm aware that local authorities are overburdened with these growing SEND caseloads and they're under-resourced. But despite welcome recent additional government funding, they still struggle to meet the timely needs of families, often resulting in children having to wait months and even years for a formal assessment and diagnosis, or increasingly often, and in desperation, having to fund expensive private clinical assessments and diagnosis to progress their EHCPs to ensure appropriate LA support is provided quickly. With demand surging and government funding static, the future looks pretty grim. Yet early intervention is, I think we all probably will contend, is absolutely essential, although too many delays prevent appropriate and timely assessment and diagnosis being readily available. often resulting in even more problems arising. ASD, for example, is frequently accompanied by at least one co-occurring condition or comorbidity such as ADHD, anxiety, depression, gastrointestinal and immune function disorders, or even epilepsy. It is a source of continuing frustration to many of us in education that similar frustrations were expressed 25 years ago. And yet, despite so many wonderful advances having been made in other areas of our national education, health and social care services, there is still no definitive clinical test for autism, with far too many families still struggling to get the timely, wholesome support they and their children so desperately need. As a teacher, as well as more importantly being grandfather to Harry, my wonderful 17-year-old severely autistic grandson, who for many years was non-verbal, who still won't eat and has multiple medical issues, including Crohn's disease, I know only too well from both a professional and personal perspective the angst and hurdles families and their carers often have to deal with while facing the day-to-day challenges of having a child with special educational needs, including being on the spectrum. My wife and I are constantly amazed at the resourcefulness and total commitment my daughter and her family have towards my eldest grandson. But she, like so many other mothers, constantly struggle with a system that should be there to assist them with the vicissitudes of neurodiversity, yet too often she is forced to constantly nag and nag again to get the service and support my grandson needs. Each and every child is unique. But children and young adults who are neurodiverse and differently abled, and in particular those nearly 1.2 million children on the spectrum, have even more to contend with than most, and they rightly deserve better and more timely support from all agencies to assist them cope with the often overwhelming issues they and their families have to deal with each and every day. People tend to forget in schools and colleges and other places that the demands on families, they're 25 hours a day and they're 8 days a week. They never stop. My grandson wakes at 5 o'clock, he doesn't go to bed until 10 o'clock, and he is hyper for the whole period of time. Absolutely hyper. Whilst in schools support is dependent on EHCPs and the local authorities' funding, I'm mindful that at university, students need official evidence of a diagnosed disability to access support by registering with the university's disability services or their equivalent with their EHCP or other form of diagnosis if they have one, and so many still don't have EHCPs at university. Human, the charity, confirmed yesterday that out of 80 universities recently surveyed, nearly half of students stated that they had mental health issues that have negatively impacted on their studies. Disability services work with students to identify and support individual needs in a similar manner as SENCOs do. However, the language and terminology used by the various agencies to ensure appropriate and beneficial support is often different, confusing, and complicated. A new caseworker recently commented that my grandson probably had significant impairment of intelligence. We took exception at that phrase because he didn't know Harry, and he doesn't seem to be aware that many young adults with ASD have exceptional abilities in areas where they have a keen interest. Neurodiversity was a term coined by an Australian sociologist, Judy Singer, in the late 1990s, and represents the different ways in which people do anything, from thinking, moving, behaving, to visualizing, communicating, and processing information. It is not a single condition and can include anyone. It encompasses a large number of people who may diverge from what is regarded as the mean. Over the years, neuroscientists have tried to work out the many links between body, brain, and life experiences. Categorization is one way to help deal with the obvious complexity. The first attempt to consider mental illness in the US was the recording of the frequency of idiocy and insanity in the 1840 census. By 1880, 7 categories of mental health were identified, and these 7 grew to over 365 diagnostic categories in 2000. When narrow diagnostic categorization doesn't or can't quite capture all the ways conditions express themselves, there is a tendency to cluster and create acronyms and specialized language. This clumping together may help experts to think about the ways to deal with such complexity, but it rarely helps improve patient outcomes or care. A dichotomous approach to neurodiversity and mental illness means young people get bounced too often between different agencies and services. Silos in education, training, service delivery models, and different funding mechanisms, together with socioeconomic biases, all influence diagnostic pathways. Early intervention and personalized interventions offer a way to improve outcomes and should be encouraged over crude labeling so that greater focus is given to individuals and their specific needs as early as possible. Having recently semi-retired, I'm particularly keen to give greater voice to those who are differently abled. I know from personal experience that with the right care and support, those with mild, moderate, and even severe learning difficulties can achieve significant success in their chosen fields. Sadly, too many who control SEND and disability budgets too often opt for an unrealistic and divisive discourse that emphasizes strengths without acknowledging the challenges. A new realism is urgently needed. We can't change the world simply by looking at it, but we can change the world because of the way we live in it, which is why my wife and I are so passionate about championing neurodiverse children and young adults. I think the concept of realism and reality as the focus areas of the lectures and awards that we have agreed to fund here at LSBU works particularly well as it incorporates the need for greater academic research, professional insight, and lived experiences, and also hopefully adds real value to the many families desperate to learn more so they can better help their very special children. Today marks the first of 5 annual lectures on neurodiversity my wife and I are delighted to sponsor here at LSBU. And I'm delighted that the inaugural lecture will be given by Stephen Unwin. Stephen is a celebrated theatre and opera director who has held several academic positions, for example, at the University of California, Cambridge University, Kingston University, and here at LSBU, where he is writer-in-residence and a visiting fellow. Stephen's second son, Joey, has severe learning disabilities, and Stephen has campaigned tirelessly for the way SPLD is regarded. Stephen is also chairman of CADS, a national charity which provides a wide range of services to disabled young people and their families, and is patron of Dramatize, a wonderful company which provides drama for young people with learning disabilities. Thank you for giving your time to attend this lecture. I hope you find it interesting as well as informative. Stephen.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction. And I was honoured to be invited to give this talk. I'm going to call it a talk, not a lecture, by Professor Martin and Michael Lewis. And I'm grateful to them and to everybody here for their generosity and hospitality. But I will admit straight away to deep-rooted imposter syndrome. I have had a few university posts over the years for kind of a couple of weeks here and a couple of weeks there, but I am not a fully paid up academic at all. I'm no scholar. I have no full-time academic post. The best I have is a degree in English literature from a chilly university in East Anglia, but I'm not sure if that counts. What I do have, though, is extensive lived experience as a father. And my lovely second son, Joey, now 25, has no speech, intractable epilepsy, and severe learning disabilities. He's not autistic, I should just add in terms of this conversation. But I think there's some pictures. I don't know how to do them. Can you do them? There's Joey, looking very serious. There's Joey in Norfolk looking happier. And there's Joey on his 18th birthday. Okay, so that's Joey on his 18th birthday. You could maybe keep that there if you want, so when you get bored of looking at me, or you can look at something nice. As you can see, hi Joey, he'll probably FaceTime me in a minute. He has a big smile and an infectious laugh, but needs a lot of help with really the most basic of life skills, changing his clothes, cooking his dinner, going on a bus, brushing his teeth, toileting and the rest. He can say nope, and he can say yet, and hilariously and most wonderfully recently, he's learned how to say cup of tea, which is cup of tea. But that's the full extent of his speech. Now, there's other means of communication, certainly. He communicates with a mixture of very, very simple Makaton and persistence. He's much loved by lots of people and generates huge joy. God, it's already getting to me, isn't it? But this experience of being Joe's dad is central to what follows. For the fact is, it's changed my life in very, very deep ways. As Michael said, I've become a campaigner for the rights and dignities of learning disabled people, particularly profoundly learning disabled people, written plays, articles, appeared on the radio, and chaired this fantastic charity, Kids. More importantly, perhaps, it's challenged some of my most deeply felt assumptions about the worth of intelligence itself, and helped me rethink the values that I was brought up with. I've spent the last 2 years, well, through lockdown, writing a book called The Golden Smile, which is still unpublished. Anybody got a publisher, let me know, which is an attempt to show how changing attitudes have led to changed lives, both for good and ill, from the Greeks to the present day. It's made me understand that it's impossible to support people with learning disabilities without a clear understanding of the culture that surrounds them, and the two are intimately connected. And that's the issue that I really want to talk about. I want to talk tonight about the contradictions that are evident in a study of the history of how learning disabilities have been perceived and talked about. And I hope that that will give some indication of what I think might be a way forward for a better future. Let me start with a simple contradiction. The way that the process of diagnosis and labeling hasn't always helped. It was in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as I understand it, that intellectual disability first emerged as a distinct category, with idiots, as they were increasingly called, being seen as a specific subsection of humanity, requiring specialist education, support and care, while also prompting questions about the nature of their condition, and most shockingly, to what extent they could be accepted into the category of the human. But this wasn't always the case. As Simon Jarrett, who is sitting there, who's the eminent historian of this subject, in his absolutely magisterial book, Those They Called Idiots, shows, learning disabled people in Georgian London and other times were absorbed into the general population in a less, how should we say, less categorized fashion. And as Chris Goody and others have said, which I think is very, very important, it's difficult to discover evidence of learning disabled people before the arrival of this taxonomy. It's not that they didn't exist, of course they did, it's that they weren't widely recognized as a distinct group, except importantly in law, where their capacity was important in terms of inheritance and finance and other areas of capacity. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, however, and influenced by the pseudoscience of eugenics, learning disabled people were increasingly seen as an existential threat, what was called a social menace. They were divided into categories with ghastly terms like imbeciles, the feeble-minded, morons, and the rest, all indicating varying degrees of mental impairment. These categories then dictated accommodation in asylums, institutions, and colonies, with the most profoundly disabled positioned as far away from the main entrance as possible. It's one of the fascinating things about the structure of the colonies and the asylums. Joey wouldn't have been welcome on the high street, is the truth of it. And then soon, responding to an entirely unscientific fear of the heritability of learning disabilities, thousands of people across America and Europe, tens of thousands, were forcibly sterilized, leading ultimately to the horror of the Nazi persecutions, which caused the death of as many as 250,000 disabled people. If only this had been the end of it. But the truth is that eugenic thinking continued after the war. And in fact, William Beveridge, the great prophet or the great constructor of the welfare state, in 1943, he slipped out of the gallery of the House of Commons to go and address the ladies and gentlemen of the Eugenics Society at the Mansion House to assure them that his plan, the plan that created the NHS and all the other things that we treasure so much, was, quote, eugenicist in intent and would prove so in effect. And soon new names appeared after the war: subnormality, retardation, mental handicap, ad nauseam, and with further provision dictated and rationed by such labels. And of course, the process continues. Now, I recognize that identifying and naming the cause of an impairment, if I may use that word, can help in practical ways, and I'm certainly not in any sense anti-science. But the truth is, I often find myself quietly pleased that Joey is what's called a SWAN, syndrome without a name. It's a beautiful name, isn't it? A SWAN. He doesn't have a label that can be attached to him. And what that has made me understand more and more and more is what matters isn't the label. What matters is providing a good life. What matters is the politics surrounding it, which is what I find myself engaged with most of all. That's just the first of several contradictions. A second contradiction can be found in the way that artists and intellectuals, of which I think I probably stand accused, many of them self-proclaimed progressives, have responded to learning disabled people in the past, and it's pretty unedifying stuff. Thus, Bernard Shaw insisted that the only fundamental socialism is the socialization of the selective breeding of man, under which we should find ourselves committed to killing a great many people whom we now leave living, and to leave living a great many people whom we at present kill. Eugenic politics, he insisted, would finally land us in an extensive use of the lethal chamber. And, quote, a great many people would have to put out of existence simply because it wastes other people's time to look after them. That's Bernard Shaw, who wrote The Soul of Man Under Socialism, and is one of the great progressive playwrights. Using the same horrible phrase, D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence, you've all read D.H. Lawrence, described a lethal chamber as big as the Crystal Palace with a military band playing softly. And he volunteered to bring them all in, the sick, the halt and the maimed, saying that he would lead them gently and they would smile me a weary thanks and the brass band would softly bubble out the Hallelujah chorus. It's a sort of suburban Treblinka, isn't it? And perhaps most shockingly, from my mind, I've always found the most shocking of all is Virginia Woolf, okay? That great prophet and genius. In 1915, wrote in her diary, and she was undergoing a lot of challenges at the time, but she wrote, on the towpath we met and had to pass a long line of imbeciles. The first was a very tall man, just queer enough to look at twice, but no more. The second shuffled and looked aside, and then one realized that everyone in that long line was a miserable, ineffective, shuffling, idiotic creature with no forehead or no chin, and an imbecile grin or a wild, suspicious stare. It was perfectly horrible. They should certainly be killed. No room of their own for that lot, it seems. So the fact is that learning disabled people have been the subject of continuous prodding by intellectuals for centuries, with classical philosophers from Plato to Locke and on, wondering whether they should be numbered among the human. And I'm afraid this line of inquiry persists to this day. Thus, the geneticist Richard Dawkins, again, another apparently progressive figure, in response to an inquiry from a woman about what to do if she found she was carrying a fetus with Down syndrome, replied, abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. He denied eugenicist intent, but it's hard to understand what he meant by immoral in such a context. He also tweeted that it's wrong to conclude that eugenics wouldn't work in practice, insisting, and this is astonishing coming from a famous geneticist, insisting that it works for cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and roses. Why on earth wouldn't it work for humans? An even more egregious example is the animal rights prophet Peter Singer, distinguished professor of bioethics at Princeton, who's argued that human beings like my Joey, who failed to develop speech, should be seen as less than human, insisting that if we compare a severely defective human infant with a non-human animal, we will often find the non-human to have superior capacities, both actual and potential, for rationality, self-consciousness, communication, and everything else that can plausibly be considered morally significant. That's Peter Singer, distinguished professor. He was involved in a public meeting with my friend, the philosopher Eva Feder-Kitte, who's the mother of a woman with profound learning disabilities. And Kitte showed up the shallowness of his arguments, above all that he knew virtually nothing about learning disabled people. I'd never met Joey or anybody else. And when Singer tried to reassure Eva Kitte that he had no desire to hurt her feelings, she went to the heart of the matter. And I think this is very important. She said, that's not what it's about. For me, it's not what I'm experiencing. It's what your writings might mean for public policy. That's what concerns me. And that's not just about my daughter. And this emphasis on public policy is really the essential thing that I hope arises from these contradictions that I'm describing. Such contradictions can be seen in less exalted places too. When England lost the European football final, whenever it was, Twitter was ablaze, and I'm a Twitter addict, as some of you know, was ablaze with progressives condemning the, quote, racist morons who were blaming the black players who apparently failed to score the penalties. And I just found myself thinking, racism is bad, certainly, but it seems to me that these people think that attacking learning disabled people using the language of hatred towards the learning disabled is allowed. Racist morons. What's that all about? So I think that progressives should recognize the experience of learning disabled people and acknowledge their own historic prejudices in this area. A different kind of contradiction can be found in the 1960s theory of normalization. This posited the unremarkable, if essential, idea that learning disabled people should be able to live normal, ordinary lives, and has had a huge impact. Normalization wasn't quite as novel as its proponents claimed. What was new, I think, was its scale and ambition. This wasn't just a better way of looking at quote-unquote vulnerable people. It was a comprehensive approach to lives, services, and culture. Normalization, however, begs certain important questions. The first is that despite protestations to the contrary, it was, especially in Europe, seen in the context of hospitals, which could offer, I quote, an intensive training environment which, whilst not normal in itself, will nevertheless help to normalize people. We were mentioning diversity earlier. This is about saying there can't be difference, I beg your pardon, there shouldn't be difference, there should be normalization, normality. Further contradiction, many of the definitions of normalization and normality reflected the values of the time. Thus, one male champion declared in the early 1970s that, quote, residents are encouraged to undertake the roles they would have in a normal family. This will make you laugh. The women doing the domestic chores and assisting in the day-to-day care of the children, and the men going out to work. Or make you angry, possibly. And so normality is as much of a social construct as the abnormality it was trying to displace, it seems. Third, under normalization, learning disabled people were expected to lead lives like the rest of us, with little interrogation of the way that, quote unquote, normal society needs to change, not just in terms of attitude and understanding, but legislation and public expenditure. Perhaps normalization's most contentious assumption was about what learning disabled people actually want. Central to the identity of many, as we know, is a defiant unconventionality, with a rejection of many of the norms of mainstream society. After all, why should they be like everybody else? For the fact is, and this is essential, learning disabled people come in all shapes and sizes, just like we all do. And any generalization, I think, increasingly is counterproductive. In other words, the blanket notion of normality should be resisted if we're to engage properly with the needs and lives of this loosely defined and heterogeneous group. Or maybe we just need to think more carefully about what we mean by normal. Normalization was in many ways a reaction against the dreadful conditions discovered in institutions. The accounts are stomach churning, and some of you may know them. In America, Willowbrook, Letchworth Village, and the Fairfield Hospital in Oregon. in Britain, South Ockenden, Normansfield, or the Ely Hospital in Cardiff, to name just a very few of the dozens of examples. This is going to be difficult, but let one stand for many. Thus, in 1972, the American journalist Geraldo Rivera made a television documentary about Letchworth in upstate New York. He wrote of the young girls he found in one of the buildings. Many of them had physical deformities, he wrote. Most were literally smeared with feces. And he concluded with words that should shame us all, even though it is back in 1972, are we good enough? He said, but they were, I don't know if I'll get through this, but they were, after all, just girls, little girls. And those little girls, just like your sister or daughter, wanted to be held and loved. When we walked into the wards, they came towards us. I wanted to hold them, but it was too frightening. They were like lepers, and I was afraid they would somehow infect me. Rivera could have been at the liberation of Dachau, and it's hardly surprising to read his impassioned cry, we've got to close that goddamn place down. And indeed, as a result of such justified outrage, most of these places were closed down, and the people who lived there were moved. But it's here that another contradiction emerges, because all too often residents were torn from the places they'd lived in for their entire lives and abandoned with insufficient help or support in the so-called community. There are dreadful stories of people being moved into flats with just one black plastic bag containing all their worldly possessions. Thus, it's not good enough to close down bad institutions if you don't have suitable accommodation for the people to move into. What's more, the move from the institutions didn't stop the violence and cruelty chronicled so harrowingly in Catherine Quarmby's Scapegoat, a brilliant, brilliant book. Indeed, learning disabled people living lonely lives in the community seem particularly prone to such attacks. And it's not even as if the curse of bad institutions was lifted. Although many of the large ones were closed, smaller ones survived, some even thrived, and we now find ourselves in the grotesque situation of private care companies making vast profits running homes and communities which are frankly not fit for purpose, with dreadful stories of neglect, cruelty, and abuse. You know the names, and if you don't, look them up. Winterbourne View, Walton Hall, and right now the inquiry into Muckamore Abbey, ad infinitum, it seems. Every week there's a new one. And then, of course, there are the ATUs and the other deeply unsuitable hospital settings where some of the worst violations of human rights have taken place, often defended as a response to so-called challenging behaviour. In other words, it's not good enough to declare institutions bad, communities good. Instead, we should understand what it is that individuals require and create accommodation and support which is responsive to their individual needs. I know this from personal experience. When Joey's epilepsy became dangerous, and I'm saying really dangerous, he was having 14 or 15 seizures a week, going to the hospital once a week. It was obvious he couldn't live at home anymore because epilepsy at night, unsupervised, can be fatal. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So his mum and I had to shock the local authority into taking his needs seriously and place him in an epilepsy specialist centre to which he is still attached. And there aren't many of them. Frankly, I dread to think what would have happened without it. I think we should attend to such contradictions when we talk about institutions. Normalization, I'm halfway through. Normalization was followed by a more radical idea that learning disabled people should shape their own lives and plot their own future. With its all-important mantra of nothing about us without us, self-advocacy argues that the best way to secure flourishing lives is to let learning disabled people speak for themselves and listen to what they have to say. It's hard to establish a definitive history of self-advocacy and needs a self-advocate to do it. I'm certainly not the right person to do it. But the spark was struck, as I understood, in the early 1970s when a conference included learning disabled delegates for the first time. And when the next year a group was discussing what to call the emerging movement, someone called out, "I'm tired of being called retarded, we're people first." And the inaugural People First conference soon followed, and it's now a worldwide movement. Self-advocacy means different things in different contexts. But I think every self-advocate believes that a learning disabled person is a person first, not a condition, and should be responsible for all the decisions about their own lives and their future. The fact is, however, that self-advocacy, which I think is probably the most significant advance in this whole dark history, and I really, really do, has its own contradictions, especially when it comes to people like my Joey with severe learning disabilities, where self-advocacy is, by its very nature, privileges the most articulate. Because, of course, some learning disabled people don't have a physical voice at all, Joey being one. Some can communicate their wishes with assistive technology, and others have elective mutism, and there are all sorts of other reasons. But there are people like my Joey, who's only just mastered cup of tea at the age of 25, and frankly insisting that he should speak up for himself and tell us what he wants to do, I would suggest is unrealistic and counterproductive. I have seen these contradictions in practice when well-meaning social workers have asked for Joey's views on his future. They provide forms which ask the person to complete a sentence beginning with an I. These are reach forms. I want to do this, I want to live like that, and so on. But I've sometimes had to, the honest truth is, stifle my laughter is too big a word, but stifle something. Not at the nobility of the aspiration, but the gap between it and the reality. Because the fact is, when I write, I, Joey, want to live with my friends, he's not speaking, I'm speaking for him, which is the absolute opposite of what self-advocacy should be all about. So there is a problem here at its shall we say, with people with profound learning disabilities like Joey. I think there is a way through this, and that is to conceive of a less binary notion of self-advocacy. Because Joey's presence at a meeting about his future is, of course, a speech act in itself. And I know that working in the theatre. Somebody on stage speaks even before they speak. And it should be understood as such that it's a speech act. He may not be speaking in the ordinary sense of the word, but his beating heart and living breath make him much more than just a name on a sheet of paper. Now, some self-advocates object to the voice of parents like me, especially when their offspring are over 18. But while some parents do present obstacles, whether from a lack of imagination, an excess of negativity, or unresolved feelings of grief, they shouldn't be too heavily criticized if they sometimes get the balance right, if they don't always get the balance right. They're not necessarily infantilizing their loved ones if they worry about their welfare, because it's love, it's overwhelming love that drives us. There's some parents here, I know. And there are far too many stories of family members not being listened to with catastrophic results for us to simply say parents don't have a role or families don't have a role. I recognize why it's nuanced and complicated, but we have to think this through in a more sophisticated way than sometimes the debate allows. And what's more, parents have often done extraordinary things, whether it's Judy Frid founding MenCap back in the 1940s, right through to my friend Sarah Ryan's inspirational campaign for justice for her son, Connor. And of course, there are hundreds of others. In conclusion, while the movement to ensure that learning disabled people can enjoy full human rights is immeasurably strengthened by the voices of the learning disabled people themselves, we should recognize its limits when it comes to articulating the wishes of people with the most severe disabilities. And this is the really provocative thing I'm going to say. Anything else is, quite frankly, ableist. Further contradictions can be found in the social model. I'm getting there. This insists that instead of talking about deficit, we should accommodate difference. Above all, that we should stop regarding disability as pathological and as a defect, and understand it as something that society needs to engage with and adapt to accordingly. In other words, people are disabled by the world, not by the impairment. The social model has had a massive impact, and I've certainly found it useful when I've challenged the authorities about why my Joey should be excluded from opportunities that his non-disabled brother and sister take for granted. The social model helps us see that a well-organised society upholds the individual's rights as a matter of course. For all its strengths, however, it too begs some difficult questions. First, it fails to acknowledge, I think, sometimes the full extent of some disabilities, including the medical issues that are sometimes comorbidities. Joey's epilepsy is just one personal example. And of course, learning disabled people face perfectly ordinary medical issues of their own, as do we all. So you can't say learning disabled people should never be in a hospital or in a medical setting. That is neglect. And the problem is that even well-meaning health professionals sometimes let them down. This came clear in the COVID-19 crisis when learning disabled people initially appeared lower down the triage ranking than they should have done and weren't prioritized for vaccination among vulnerable groups. And I'm afraid they suffered enormously disproportionately with much higher death rates than other groups. Second, the social model is more useful with physical than learning disabilities, especially severe ones. It's one thing to insist on ramps to make buses accessible, but I suggest it's quite different to insist that bus drivers all learn Makaton. Accommodating different kinds of minds isn't necessarily straightforward. The social model has led to a further debate about whether we should regard learning disabilities as an impairment at all, with some insisting that people without evident physical disabilities aren't in fact disabled. Others say that we should always be talking about learning differences, not learning disabilities. You won't be surprised to hear that I have a problem with that, which is not to say that someone like Joey is only disabled. After all, he has a definite personality, settled preferences, and a highly developed sense of humour. But there are many things he can't do that the vast majority of human beings can do, and there's not many things apart from licking my bald head that he can do which others can't. He's distinctly disabled, and it's dishonest to say anything else, in my opinion. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. For good reasons, this is a slightly more positive area. For good reasons, learning disabled people and their families are often encouraged to move away from the tragedy model. And certainly there are many positives in the experience. Sorry, I'm just going a bit dry here. I encountered this on my best friend Twitter, of all places. It was the afternoon of New Year's Day 2021, and I was lying on the sofa with Joey giggling at one of our absurd jokes. I think I was burping in his ear or something. And I took a few selfies, and I tweeted one of them out with a simple, deeply ironic message: so terrible being the dad of a learning disabled young man. Ping, you know. I thought nothing more of it until I returned to my phone and saw a steady stream of notifications. Ginny, you'll remember this. I was especially struck by the scores of pictures which kept coming in of families with a learning disabled relative doing happy, ordinary things, climbing mountains, walking on a beach, bouncing on trampolines, posing in pajamas, all laughing, smiling, and having infectious fun. But each, and this is what I loved most of all, carried its own message of mock gloom: another day of misery, awful sadness, such dreadful hell. To which I replied to every single one of them with mock sympathy: oh, how awful, so grim, thoughts and prayers, etc. And for 3 frantic hours, I could hardly keep up with this stuff. My phone was just... and when I woke up on Saturday, it was still going strong. For those of you who like Twitter, 23,000 likes. There you go. And by Monday morning, I was on Radio 4 talking about what had happened and what it meant, which is the point. And I think it was clear that in a funny, sort of random kind of way, Joey and I, purely accidentally, had struck a chord. And I think it's this: because families of learning disabled children are so often made to feel that their situation is somehow desperate, I think my tweet encouraged them to demonstrate that they don't just love their person to the moon and back, but he or she has taught them more about life than anyone could possibly imagine. And that's certainly my experience. I think it also showed something else, and I didn't write this, and I should have. What it also showed is that the problem is society. It's not us worrying about, it's not our love for our kids. It's that the problem is not in the family, the problem is elsewhere. 99% of the time. Something similar happened on the day that children get their GCSE results. I tweeted a picture of Joey with a request to remember the young people who've never got a qualification in their lives. Joey's never got a qualification, which got a huge response. And the biggest was on Joey's 25th birthday, when I posted a picture with a simple message that he's never said a word in his life, but has taught me so much more than I've ever taught him, which was trending apparently for a bit. And the point is, I think that people were, if only for a moment, opening their hearts and minds, people outside of this room who know this stuff, I'm talking about way out there, were opening their hearts and minds, to learning disabled people and recognizing their value. It was a genuine political moment of sorts. But while I love the positivity that those tweets unleashed, I think we should be careful, and not just because Twitter is an echo chamber desperately prone to confirmation bias. The first is because parents and siblings and families and grandparents shouldn't be bullied into stifling negative emotions. There are many times when Joey's family find him, how shall we say, infuriating. And we sometimes compare the trigger points. I had a beer with his brother the other day, and we were comparing what drives you mad. Well, what this drives. And I want to say that I don't think that that's a wrong thing. I think that's an important part of this experience. It's entirely appropriate and natural, because it's quite possible to find people infuriating and love them. And I suggest that most of you have that with people who you care about. The bigger danger about such boosterism is that it creates hierarchies within learning disabilities. As an example, MenCap has recently rolled out an awareness campaign called Mythbusters. I don't want to have a crack. Well, I'm going to have a little crack. This aims to discredit the idea that learning disabled people are incapable and profiles a number of learning disabled people who are achieving great things. This, it's felt, will help the public think of learning disabled people in a more positive way. So far, so good. I'm with it. I get that. And the arts, my area, often do something similar, producing uplifting stories of learning disabled people overcoming the odds to do remarkable things, but usually without any reference to where the problem is, which is social provision, whether it's education or accommodation or healthcare or whatever it is. So it's always about private experiences of conquering obstacles, never actually about society's responsibility to its brothers and sisters. I keep losing the danger with all this is that it creates a hierarchy within learning disabilities with the mythbusters, the exceptions at the top, and people like dear Joey at the bottom. It unwittingly suggests that people only deserve support if they're capable of achieving great things. I suppose that's the law of unforeseen consequences. The underlying problem is the very notion of the meritocracy. We all think that wealth, power, and opportunities shouldn't be inherited, but aren't. But not only is this an illusion, and it is an illusion, it doesn't help people who fail those meritocratic tests. And the problem is that love, powerful as it is, doesn't conquer all, despite what the classics would tell us. As I often say, every family of a learning disabled child or young person is different, but what unites us, and I'm looking at some of them there, but what unites us is the endless struggle to secure fundamental human rights for our loved ones. One example are the countless forms where you have to emphasize the negative in order to secure the support that's needed. Masterpieces of bureaucratic hurtfulness, as I once put it, and I like that. And hardly a day goes by when I'm not asked to give advice to a family struggling to get help. Love is the easy bit. It's society, it's politics, it's provision, which is the hard bit. So what I think we need is a new template, if you like, a new social contract, which recognizes the undeniable fact of difference, of endless difference, and does everything in its power to provide help to those who need it most. And I think that could allow for what I would call a more open-hearted declaration of worth. I recently expressed, in writing and then on the telephone, my condolences to the mother of a learning disabled young woman, 35-year-old, who had died of SUDEP, sudden death from epilepsy, a very dear friend of Joey's. And her daughter, I said to her, was infinitely valuable as anybody alive, and had changed the lives of everyone she came into contact with. Because the real nightmare, and this is what I think, again, families and I think others people feel, is that in some sense their loved one isn't regarded as valuable as the others. And it's as if, as the Nazis would have said, they were leading lives unworthy of life. That's the horror that I think many, many families confront dealing with some of these issues. So what I think we should do is start, finally, valuing people, as the 2001, 21 years ago, report asked for. Valuing people, but that's 20 years ago, and I wonder whether we're still not valuing people. These many contradictions have infiltrated politics, where virtue signalling, the photo op, have become all-consuming and too often disconnected from the realities on the ground. A recent example of the Down Syndrome Act, which sailed through the Commons pretty much uncontested, as if our elected representatives thought that it was an easy win which would make them look good. The Act was championed by a small group of active parents, supported by some fairly unsavoury characters on the anti-abortion right, and the campaign emphasised all the remarkable things that their offspring could do. Ironically, its supporters also insisted that people with Downs have more severe medical and educational needs than others and require specialist medical and educational provision. Having your cake and eating it, it seemed to me. Now, fine legal minds have shown that the Act is entirely ineffective, but what really concerned me was the division that was being was the consequence. It was championing one fairly small group, I think 40 or 50,000, I think is the current figure, on the basis of their extra chromosome, and ignores the needs of the other almost 1.5 million people with learning disabilities in Britain. I desperately want people with Down syndrome to have better lives, but the truth is I want everyone with learning disabilities to have better lives. And I think the Act is symptomatic of a political culture which is so busy signposting that it ignores the facts on the ground. It's opened a Pandora's box that will be difficult to close. So what conclusions can be drawn? Well, the other day, a young woman with Down syndrome tweeted proudly that she could cook her own dinner. I'm great. I'm delighted that she can cook her own dinner. But, again, not everybody can cook their own dinner. And pointing this out is not a betrayal of the cause. It's not a counsel of despair. It doesn't prove that I'm a peddler of doom, as one of the ACT champions called me. Rather, it's an insistence that we accept people for what they are and not insist that they be something different. For I think at the moment we're in danger of turning our backs on the people who need help the most and to whom we owe the most profound duty of care. And that should worry us. I think we need to develop a more honest discourse around learning disabilities, a more human one, in fact, one that acknowledges the reality of fragility, even as it celebrates achievements and independence. One which embraces all our children, the disabled along with the non-disabled, the clever alongside the less clever, and remembers perhaps the dementia that so many of us will face and that Joey's lovely grandfather, 90-year-old, is facing at the moment. All of which is perhaps what my friend, the remarkable Welsh vicar, John Gillibrand, means by the theological model of disability, and I hasten to add I'm an atheist. And I think what this is a way of thinking about learning disability which is unjudgmental, non-challenging, not interested in categorizing, open to individuality and difference, and above all, the unique value of every human being. I think this could have two consequences. The first is by engaging with individual realities, support can be useful, empowering, humane. We can help people not by trying to change them, not by telling them to be better, not by imposing on them meaningless aspirations, but by accepting them as they are. After all, they are us and we are them. It's time we stood alongside them and gave them the help that they needed. But I think that could help the rest of us, and this is really important, I think. What do I mean by that? Well, I sometimes think that looking at the world through the perspective of learning disabilities is a bit like, and don't panic everybody, is a bit like Brecht's alienation effect. Now, don't worry about what that is, but that's an aesthetic theory, an aesthetic approach in which what is familiar, what you think you know as ordinary, looks odd, and what is odd looks familiar. And it changes the whole perspective of the world, if you like. And that's certainly been my experience, because I no longer think that intelligence is the most important thing there is, and I was brought up to think that. And so maybe, just maybe, people with learning disabilities can teach us how to live better lives. We certainly need help from somewhere. Now look, I'd like to end with a passage from Maureen Oswin's incredibly powerful book, The Empty Hours, a 1971 study, and if you don't know it, go and get it. It should be republished soon. A 1971 study of disabled children living in institutions, where she has a heartbreaking conversation with the 5-year-old Jason. Strictly speaking, Jason isn't learning disabled. But to my mind, little says more about the situation faced by so many learning disabled people today and the politics of learning disabilities. And it really is a plea for a better world. And I might find it difficult to get through this, but anyway. Quote, cerebral palsy had given Jason permanently withered limbs and slurred speech, Unwin writes. Family rejection had given him a never-eased homesickness. Social provision gave him a hospital to live in. A lively mind gave him an insatiable curiosity. It's a 5-year-old boy. Why can't I purr like a kitten? He asked. This was fairly easy to answer. Why did my mummy eat me? Eat you? This was startling. Yes, you told me yesterday I was in her tummy when I was a baby. How did I get there? Did she eat me? After a while, this was sorted out to our mutual satisfaction. Where do I keep my tears when I am not using them? This was a little harder. He may well wonder where they came from, for he had known more tears than most of us. Why do I get sad such a lot of times? All the pat answers from past experience with inquisitive infant children could not rescue me very comfortably from this question, she wrote. Have I got to stay all my life in this hospital? What answer now? Maureen writes. I thought of all the brave reforms through social history, the early crude attempts to help the destitute and improve workhouses, houses and factories. There were all the committees, members of parliament, journalists, civil servants, the charities, the wealthy and the poor, whose opinions and ideals have shaped English social history over the last 200 years. There were children's acts, housing acts, education acts, mental health acts, the National Health Service, and acts for divorce, criminal justice and abortion. There were laws to protect women, homosexuals, animals, immigrants, house purchasers, landlords, street vendors and car drivers. The 20th century, the age of human reasoning and compassion. But where did young Jason and his kind fit into this good age of reform and broad thinking? You're not answering me, he said. Will I have to stay all my life in this hospital? Answer me. We still have no proper answers. If you think of Jason, somebody with very profound, severe learning disabilities, we still haven't got the right answers. And I think, despite everything, learning disabled people still come last. And that's not good enough.
Thanks.
Thank you. We're going to have time for a Q&A, so I might just grab the microphone because everyone needs it, and I will do a little bit of a Annika Rice for those of you who
Annika Rice.
running around the studio.
Oh yeah, running on studio.
My cat has turned on. Yeah, just turn it on again. While we're just thinking about sort of Q&A, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
So you were talking about aspirations and self-advocacy, and I was just thinking about the new SEND review, which talks about having high aspirations, and that schools don't have high aspirations for children with SEND, and I think that's largely about qualifications and employment.
Yeah.
So I just wondered, what are or what have been your aspirations for Joey, and have they changed throughout the years as well? Were there points where you thought, actually, I want him to be able to do this, and did it change at all?
Well, that's a very good question. I was very aware in writing this that it might have sounded like I'm going, I give up. And I don't give up at all. And in fact, we've just managed to sort out that Joey's going to go swimming once a week. And that's a great breakthrough, brilliant thing. What I think is important for the family, but I think important for social policy, more importantly, and for educational policy and social accommodation policy and so on, is instead of setting, false aspirations which have got no basis in reality, because we think we should be aspirational. That's what I think we need more sophisticated mechanisms to engage with the individual. And I don't know what those mechanisms would be, and they're much cleverer people in education and social policy than me. But I think one needs to find a way of doing that. I mean, I think that academic is grotesquely overstated, but I think it is in mainstream school as well. I think there are an awful lot of other values. So I'm really not anti-aspirational, but I am really pro-accurate aspiration, truthful aspiration, for working from a truthful assessment, which celebrates the person and engages with the person, and rather than says, I had a chat about the Down Syndrome Act. One of the things that I found, and Joey hasn't got Downs, but people I know who've children with Downs, is the enormous range of ability. So it is not enough to put on the TV. You put on TV a kid with Downs who's fronting a TV show, fantastic. But you know what? When you've met one kid with Downs, you met one kid with Downs. Or you met one learning disabled person, you met one learning disabled person. I think that's great that it happens, and I understand. But don't anybody therefore imagine that everybody with Down syndrome can present a TV program, because that then is a way of making the kids with Downs who can't present a TV program, them, so they're failures, are they? And we're back in the old problems. So that, I think, is it's a very difficult balancing act to strike.
Yeah, this kind of feeds into the question that's asked. What's the story behind Joey learning to say he would like to have a cup of tea? Because there's obviously a story behind his preferences and people's preferences behind it. So it's obviously quite a recent thing as well.
It is, yeah. If I say, he doesn't say, I would like to have a cup of tea, by the way. He might just suddenly say, well, how's it sound like? Cup of tea? All right? And it's not necessarily connected with saying, I want a cup of tea. And that's one of the curious and fascinating issues. And I've written a play about this recently, which is, is connecting the word to to the desire, to the object. He says yes and no, quite often with evident accuracy, and quite often he just enjoys saying no, because he likes the sound, he likes making the noise. Your question is a very good one, and there are tiny little intellectual, I put that in quote marks, developments happening as he's growing older. He's 25. There are little things that he can do. I mean, he's now just recently learned how to FaceTime, all right? I don't know, I think he's with a carer, some assistants, and, you know, he FaceTimes me, but then he's never on the screen. He's always... So when I go, Joey, show me your T-shirt, that's what I do. Show me, so I can see you, and then eventually he wanders into frame. But these are all beautiful. These are essential and brilliant, and they're little tiny developments, like he's now more confident in getting into water. But, God, he needs a rubber ring, and not when the epilepsy is kicking in, I tell you. So those are all beautiful and important, but they're not but they're tiny, and that's okay.
Do you want the mic? I'm not as fast as
Oh, he could have come and got it.
I'm not completely sure.
Very interesting present lecture. I think on the point about when you talked about love, though, you reminded me about the controversy over the film Music, where the point is, I think the person's love wasn't that issue. It was the single-mindedness that was at fault. So how can people like me who are in the game and people like you who are in the game hold each other to account without either being too scared, reacting with such fear and loathing which is present in the scene, and equally in the sort of equally pointing out where the other or whatever other constituencies there are at fault.
I missed one crucial word, the case. Which case was that? So I'm so sorry, I just didn't quite catch that. Maybe
Right, that's fine, and actually I have to declare some skin in the game. This was a controversy over the film Music, with directed by Sia Furler.
Oh, yeah. I think the dramatic representation of learning disabilities and neurodiversities is really complicated and really challenging. And I think that there is a huge, huge importance in the nothing about us without us emphasis. When I wrote, and this isn't a truth, I wrote a play a few years ago called All Our Children, which was done in London, was done in New York, and is now being made into a film, which is about the Nazi murder of the disabled, of profoundly disabled children. And I made the choice, the decision, that I would not have profoundly disabled children coming onto the stage for the audience to be told that they were going to get murdered. Some people thought that was wrong, and I respect that. I really, really respect that. I also know, though, as a very experienced person in the arts, what would have happened, what was in danger of happening if I had done that. Because if I'd brought my Joey onto the stage, he would have walked off, he would have sat on somebody's lap, he would have not engaged in drama. So in other words, this is this is yet another area of contradiction, is what I'm trying to say. What I think is useful about contradiction as a process is you start working out what is the problem. Do you see what I mean? Through a kind of dialectical process, if you like. You work out what is the problem, and I think the problem there is about, we still haven't yet achieved the dignity that I'm striving for, and of course the arts therefore has a role to play in that. But that's the essential issue, which is the representation of, is representation which emphasizes the dignity, whether the person comes on stage or doesn't. I don't know if it's such an important conversation. I'd love to have further with it.
I'm going to start with this lady. Do you want to
Hello.
How do you change the contradiction of every child is unique, but then your child's not reaching certain milestones? Like, as a mother of an autistic daughter, like when she was 3, the child should be doing this. Then every child is unique, so which one is it? Like the contradictions start from early years.
Look, I think sorry, it's such an important question. I think that's, in a way, that's a hangover of what I was talking about earlier, which is normalization. The normal child will do this, and the odd child will do that. And it's a kind of, it's not very useful. I would say it's not very useful with non-disabled children as well. You know, I think this kind of endless quantification is not really useful. So what I think is much more interesting is what I'm trying to say here. What does your daughter need? How can we help her? Let's give her every bit of help we possibly can. Not go, oh dear, madam, your daughter hasn't jumped through this hoop. Because, you know, non-disabled kids are being examined to death in an appalling way, I think. I mean, I just don't get it anymore. But my standards are then not coming out with an education, which is another problem. But I think that's a hangover from normalization. So how do we make your child normal? Quote unquote, I hasten to add. So I think it's really difficult. But I also think that I suspect that you, like so many parents, are having to fight the fight. And that's the nightmare. I mean, I've got 3 kids. The paperwork for Joey is like, in my office, paperwork for B is sort of like that. And for Laurie, who's 30, there isn't any paperwork, you know. And that's a system completely wrong. It just doesn't work. So you and so many other parents are carrying this thing around, and it should be like, you've got this lovely daughter what does she need? You know, I think, you know, I said something about redefining self-advocacy. I suppose one of the things that I think there is that there are an awful lot of things that I need help with. There are an awful lot of things that Joey needs help with. I can't do my tax, I can't fix my car, I can hardly change a plug. You know, there's so many things that I can't do and I need help with. So let us, instead of going, you're either an entirely autonomous human being or you need help with everything, actually recognize that we all need help. And let's kind of, I think my big thing, and it's probably me speaking as an artist, not as a social scientist, if you like, is there just needs to be a bit more imagination in this, and a bit more humanity, and a bit more individuality, dealing with, I don't know if I've answered your question. Such a good question.
Hi, we've talked about this before, Steve. I think there's...
Oh, Saskia, I didn't see you under the mark.
Hi, I can take it off.
No, you're wise.
I think there's a real problem with the way we as parents or siblings have to emphasise the deficits of people in order to get services,
Yeah.
because it builds up a sort of psychic distress. You basically feel shame or guilt or anger. And what I'm quite keen on is saying to people, actually, my profoundly learning disabled autistic brother with severe epilepsy gives meaning to at least 4 or 5 people every week. They have a job, which is to support him, make sure he's happy, make sure he's well looked after. They learn from him. He's actually incredibly valuable. And I think if parents and siblings have that attitude sometimes, which is actually, my relative who has these needs is providing something to society, that would change the music. Because I think we've talked about the fact that, you know, you and I were children, mentally handicapped, retarded, those were the terms, they've all changed. I remember when my brother suddenly was called learning disabled, which was well into his 40s, and thinking, that's not his problem. He's not a problem in class, he's way too old for that.
Yeah.
I'm for intellectual cognitive.
Yeah, I
But
agree.
every single time these names change, they become something else. So my now 18-year-old son has gone through the system with some learning disabilities, and the insult that he's grown up with is, oh, you're a spesh, as in special needs. And special needs was coined as a positive term.
Mary Warnock,
Right. So my feeling is that whatever names we come up with, neurodivergent, neurodiverse, learning disabled, you know, whatever, people will always end up using it as an insult until we change the idea that everybody can be happy if they're well supported, and that there is joy and real meaning in the life of a teacher, a care assistant, the person who's driving the minibus to the swimming pool, that they are doing something wonderful and they're going to get a lot out of it. I know the people who work with my brother, when things are going well, have a better job than somebody working in the city making a fortune, doing awful things, you know. And I just think we need to change that.
Yeah.
I don't think the social model works because my brother isn't necessarily disabled entirely by society. His epilepsy is not a matter of ramps, it's a matter of medication.
Yeah.
You know, we just need to be positive and not make parents and siblings have to go through such a negative representation of their relative in order to get services. So anyway, too much talking, sorry.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
James, over there.
Yeah, there's a couple of points I was going to make. One is around that, like, it's in a lot of companies and organisations' interests to sell the idea of happiness and that people should be happy and that parents and family members should be happy and people with learning disabilities and other kind of disabilities should be happy. And the idea around happiness is quite pervasive in our society, and I would argue it's linked towards like neoliberalism and kind of neoliberal norms and stuff. And I think fundamentally we need to change our culture and society away from like neoliberalism. So I think there's a lot of problems from that. But I also think there's a couple of comments around kind of Saskia, you know, you're kind of comments around social model. I think there's a kind of misconception around what the social model actually is. The social model is just a tool. It's just a tool to remove barriers to accessing kind of normal opportunities for a normal life, but it's not meant to describe anything else. And the social model itself recognises that people can be disabled under like the medical model kind of view of stuff, and that it would encourage people to receive medical model like treatments and stuff if they need it.
Yeah.
And it's the medical model itself isn't perfect. I'm sorry, the social model isn't perfect, and there's other kind of concepts within disability studies that actually do describe and explain kind of this disabled lived experience, and I mean disabled in that kind of term as in within a medical model way, in how you kind of talk about epilepsy and you kind of the kind of medical needs of your son and stuff. So it's, and the reason I'm saying this is because there needs to be more nuance around discussions around the social model, just as much as more nuance around kind of expectations and how we kind of support and people with LD and other kind of categories and stuff. And
Yeah. I simplified it too much, and I take that.
Sorry if I'm being a bit too kind of autistic about it.
No, it's good. It's important. I think it's important. Thank you for that. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Just a comment. Just picking up actually on what was said about the sort of milestones of as a child, as you grow up, and it's just coming back to this thing about contradiction. Is how do we get help for those people who do need help, who will benefit from special education, EHCPs and special education needs and all of that. If there isn't a sort of, not a checklist, well, what is it if it's not a checklist, if it's not the milestones?
Well,
how do we catch that so that we do respond? So society can respond to need on an individual basis, and but not trap people in the, oh dear, your child isn't living up to expectations.
Well, I'll tell you what I think about that is, personally, I think that there are a lot of things about the Children's and Families Act of 2014 which are actually pretty good, which is which provided the idea of the EHCPs. I think the problem, and KIDS was involved in trying to sort this out at one point, the problem is the implementation of the EHCPs. Because the EHCPs, basically what they do is they identify, for those of you who don't know, the education healthcare plans, they identify what does the young person, and of course EHCPs only go up to 25, don't they? And there's life after that, and there's too much emphasis on young people, but anyway. But the EHCP identifies the need and then goes, right, these are the range of needs in education, health and social care, and now here is the solution. But of course, the local authorities desperately and absurdly, well, sometimes with you can understand why they're doing it because their budgets are so slashed, are fighting against it. And so they want to make it as difficult as possible because then, now I know a lawyer who fights this and she says everybody who goes to tribunal wins, and that the local authorities have factored that into their budget, that the families are under. But families having to go to tribunal is madness that we've got into that situation. It's absolutely mad. We should have a... So I think the Act is, I'm sure more legal minds than I would know that there are issues with the Act, but I think in general terms, it's not so bad. It's not bad, but the delivery is appalling, and a lottery by region, by must wrap up.
No, I better have a mic because it's good inclusive practice, isn't it? Thank you. Thanks. Well, I wasn't going to ask any questions, but I just want to say, A,